I'll never forget the moment on September 28, 1944, when Obergefreiter Klaus Weber threw his body over mine as Luftwaffe bombs tore through our field hospital near Eindhoven, his blood soaking into my medic uniform as he whispered in broken English, "American doctor must live to help more soldiers." The Dutch countryside was exploding around us, the smell of antiseptic mixing with cordite and burning canvas, while Glenn Miller's "In the Mood" still played from a radio that had somehow survived the first wave of the attack. I was Staff Sergeant Michael "Mickey" O'Brien, 101st Airborne Division Medical Corps, and after jumping into Normandy on D-Day and 3 months of treating wounded paratroopers from Sainte-Mère-Église to Operation Market Garden, I thought I understood the clear moral lines that separated American medics from German patients, healers from enemies, the duty to preserve life from the reality of taking it. I'd sewn up too many American boys torn apart by German bullets, watched too many friends die from wounds inflicted by the enemy, to feel anything but professional detachment toward Wehrmacht prisoners under my care. But what happened during that 15-minute bombing attack would shatter every assumption I'd held about German soldiers, about human nature under extreme stress, and about the possibility for enemies to choose sacrifice over self-preservation when faced with the ultimate test of character. Those German prisoners would teach me that medical ethics transcend nationality, that courage has no uniform, and that sometimes our enemies understand the Hippocratic Oath better than we do. My assignment to the field hospital near Eindhoven began on September 20th, 1944, after I was lightly wounded during the fighting for Hell's Highway and spent a week recovering from concussion and shrapnel cuts. The 101st Airborne had been deployed as part of Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's ambitious plan to end the war by Christmas through a series of airborne assaults that would open a corridor into Germany itself. The operation had achieved initial success, but German resistance was stiffening, and casualties were mounting faster than our medical facilities could handle them. Field hospitals were being established throughout the Dutch countryside to treat wounded from British, American, and Polish units involved in the offensive, along with increasing numbers of German prisoners who required medical attention under Geneva Convention requirements. When Captain Robert Morrison briefed me on my new assignment, his instructions reflected the complex reality of treating enemy wounded while our own soldiers were dying from similar injuries. "Sergeant O'Brien," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he studied my medical qualifications, "you'll be in charge of the prisoner ward at the Eindhoven facility. We've got about 40 German wounded, mostly from the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions, plus regular Wehrmacht troops captured during recent fighting." He paused, looking at me with the expression of a medical officer who understood the emotional challenges of treating enemy patients. "I know you've lost friends to German fire, Mickey. We all have. But these prisoners are patients first and enemies second. You'll provide the same standard of medical care you'd give to American wounded, regardless of personal feelings or political considerations." I nodded, but privately I wondered whether I could maintain professional objectivity while treating soldiers who wore the same uniforms as the men who'd killed my friends. Tommy Walsh from South Boston, cut down by an MG-42 near Carentan. Danny Rodriguez from Chicago, killed by a sniper outside St. Vith. Johnny Kowalski from Detroit, blown apart by a Panzerfaust during the fighting for Hell's Highway. Their faces haunted my dreams and fueled an anger that seemed incompatible with the medical ethics I'd sworn to uphold. My first day at the prisoner ward, September 21st, 1944, confirmed my worst expectations about treating German wounded. The facility was housed in a series of large canvas tents, arranged around a central surgical area, with separate sections for American, British, and German patients. The German ward held 43 prisoners, with injuries ranging from minor shrapnel wounds to severe trauma requiring major surgery. When I entered the tent for morning rounds, accompanied by Corporal Jimmy Sullivan from Brooklyn and Private First Class Tony Ricci from Philadelphia, the reaction from German patients was immediate and hostile. Conversations stopped, eyes followed our movement with suspicion and resentment, and several prisoners turned their faces away rather than acknowledge our presence. The senior German patient was Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Waldmann, a veteran sergeant from the 10th SS Panzer Division who'd lost his left leg below the knee to American artillery, but retained the bearing and attitude of a professional soldier. When I approached his bed to check his dressing, His response set the tone for what I expected would be a difficult assignment. "I do not wish to be treated by American doctor," he said in accented but clear English. "I request treatment by German medical personnel, as is my right under Geneva Convention." His tone was coldly professional, but the hatred in his eyes was unmistakable. This man had spent years fighting Americans, had probably killed American soldiers, and now found himself dependent on American medical care for his survival. "Sergeant Waldman," I replied, using his rank and maintaining medical protocol despite his hostility, "you'll receive the same standard of care as any other patient in this hospital. German medical personnel aren't available, so you'll be treated by American medics or you won't be treated at all." Other German patients were watching this exchange carefully, and I could sense them taking cues from Waldman's reaction to American medical care. If he continued to resist treatment, other prisoners might follow his lead, creating problems for everyone's recovery. Waldman stared at me for a long moment, then spoke in German to the other patients. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clearly instructional. He was telling them something about how to behave toward their American captors. Over the following days, the pattern of hostile cooperation continued. German patients accepted necessary medical treatment, but refused to engage in conversation, express gratitude, or acknowledge American efforts on their behalf. They followed Waldman's lead in maintaining military discipline and dignity while accepting the minimum medical care required for survival. But there were exceptions to this pattern that began to complicate my simple narrative of professional duty versus personal animosity. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber, a 22-year-old tank gunner from the 9th SS Panzer Division, had been severely wounded by American phosphorus rounds and was suffering from burns that covered 40% of his body. The pain was excruciating, requiring constant care and pain management that went far beyond basic Geneva Convention requirements. Unlike Waldman, Weber seemed genuinely grateful for American medical attention. When I changed his bandages or administered morphine, he would thank me in broken English and apologize for being unable to help with his own care. "American doctor," he said during one of my evening rounds, "I want you to know, I did not choose to fight your soldiers. I was conscripted into SS when I was 17. I never wanted to kill anyone." His sincerity was troubling because it challenged my assumptions about SS personnel and their motivations. Weber didn't seem like a Nazi fanatic. He seemed like a scared kid who'd been caught up in something bigger than himself. Gefreiter Hans Richter, an 18-year-old infantry soldier from the Wehrmacht's 85th Division, had been wounded during a patrol action near Nijmegen. His right arm had been shattered by American rifle fire, and infection was threatening to require amputation despite our best efforts to save the limb. During the long hours I spent treating his wound, Richter told me about his family in Bavaria, about being drafted on his 18th birthday, about his horror at seeing combat for the first time. "Herr Doctor," he said one evening as I cleaned his infected wound, "my mother is nurse in Munich hospital. She teaches me that doctors are holy people, that they help everyone regardless of politics or nationality. She would be ashamed if I was not grateful to American doctor who tries to save my arm." These individual relationships began to humanize the German prisoners in ways that made my job more emotionally complex, but also more meaningful. I was still treating enemy soldiers, but I was also treating young men who reminded me of American soldiers I'd cared for, boys who missed their families, feared death, and appreciated medical attention regardless of its source. The transformation accelerated after September 25th, when a group of severely wounded German officers arrived from fighting near Arnhem. These men were different from the enlisted soldiers I'd been treating. They were older, more experienced, and carried themselves with the bearing of professional military officers rather than reluctant conscripts. The senior officer was Major Karl Brenner, a career Wehrmacht officer who'd commanded a battalion during the retreat from Normandy. He'd been wounded by British artillery during the fighting for the Arnhem Bridge and had undergone emergency surgery by German medics before being captured and transported to our facility. When I approached his bed for initial assessment, his reaction was completely different from what I'd experienced with other German prisoners. "Doctor," he said in excellent English, standing to attention despite his wounds, "I am Major Brenner, and I wish to thank you and your medical staff for the excellent care we have received. Your treatment of German wounded has been exemplary and reflects great honor on American medical services." His formal courtesy and genuine gratitude created a ripple effect throughout the German ward. If a Wehrmacht major could express appreciation for American medical care, enlisted men could do the same, without compromising their dignity or military bearing. But the real change in relationships came through a series of medical emergencies that required German patients to trust American medics with their lives, and American medics to go beyond basic Geneva Convention requirements in caring for enemy wounded. On September 26th, Obergefreiter Weber's burns became infected despite our preventive measures, and he developed sepsis that threatened his life. The treatment required round-the-clock care, constant monitoring, and medical resources that could have been used for American patients instead. Corporal Sullivan questioned whether we should invest so much effort in saving an enemy soldier when American wounded were arriving daily from the fighting around Arnhem. "Mickey," he said privately, "this Kraut is probably going to die anyway, and we're using medical supplies that could save American boys. Is it worth it?" It was a fair question that went to the heart of medical ethics during wartime. Should enemy wounded receive the same standard of care as friendly wounded? How much effort should be expended to save lives of men who'd been trying to kill us just days earlier? My answer came from the medical oath I'd taken and the principles that had guided my care of wounded throughout the war. "Jimmy, we're medics first and soldiers second. If we start deciding who deserves to live based on uniform colors, we're no better than the SS doctors who experiment on prisoners." Weber survived the crisis, and his recovery created a bond between us that transcended military roles. He began serving as an informal translator for other German patients, helping communicate medical information and building bridges between American staff and German wounded. Major Brenner had observed this entire episode and approached me afterward with a conversation that would change my understanding of German military culture and individual character. "Dr. O'Brien," he said during one of his physical therapy sessions, "I have served in the German army for 18 years, and I have never seen enemy medical personnel provide such excellent care for German wounded. Your dedication to medical ethics, even for prisoners, reflects the best traditions of military medicine." He paused, choosing his words carefully as he continued. "I want you to know that many German officers have been disgusted by SS atrocities, by the abandonment of military honor, by the way this war has corrupted everything we once believed about soldierly conduct. Officers like myself joined the Wehrmacht to serve Germany, not to serve Nazi ideology." This conversation revealed the complexity of German military service that American propaganda never acknowledged. Brenner and officers like him had been caught between loyalty to their country and disgust with their government, between military professionalism and political extremism. "Many of us hoped that American occupation would bring democratic government to Germany," Brenner continued. "Your treatment of German prisoners gives us hope that America will be generous in victory, that you will help us rebuild our country along better principles." These relationships were developing against the backdrop of deteriorating military situation around Eindhoven. Operation Market Garden was failing. German reinforcements were arriving daily, and the corridor to Arnhem was under increasing pressure from Wehrmacht counterattacks. Our field hospital was treating mounting casualties from both sides, and the proximity to active fighting zones meant constant danger from artillery, air attacks, and ground assault. We'd been bombed twice by Luftwaffe aircraft that somehow penetrated Allied air defenses, but the attacks had been brief and caused minimal damage. That changed on the morning of September 28, 1944, when German intelligence located our hospital complex and decided to eliminate what they perceived as a significant military target. I was in the German ward, conducting morning rounds with Weber serving as translator, when the first Luftwaffe fighters appeared over the hospital compound at 09:47 hours. The sound was unmistakable. Focke-Wulf 190s, diving at high speed, their engines screaming as they approached their target. "Incoming aircraft," someone shouted from outside the tent, but there was no time to seek shelter. The first bombs exploded in the central surgical area, collapsing tents and sending shockwaves through the entire compound. The German ward erupted in chaos as wounded prisoners tried to take cover under their cots while shrapnel tore through the canvas walls above them. Weber, despite his burns and weakness from infection, immediately began helping other German patients find protection from the bombing. But it was what happened next that would change my life forever and challenge every assumption I'd held about human nature under extreme stress. As the second wave of Focke-Wulfs approached for another bombing run, I found myself caught in the open area between patient beds, with no protection from the impending attack. The tent walls provided no shelter, the floor offered no cover, and there was no time to reach a safer location. That's when Obergefreiter Klaus Weber, the German prisoner whose life I'd saved 3 days earlier, threw himself over my body as the bombs began falling around us. The explosion that followed lifted us both off the ground and slammed us against the tent wall, but Weber's body absorbed most of the shrapnel that would have killed me instantly. As we hit the ground, I could feel his blood soaking through my uniform, could hear him gasping as punctured lungs struggled to function. "American doctor must live," he whispered in English, his voice barely audible over the sound of continuing explosions. "Must live to help more soldiers." But Weber wasn't alone in his sacrifice. All around the German ward, wounded prisoners were helping each other, and incredibly helping American medical personnel survive the attack. Major Brenner, despite his own serious injuries, was directing other German patients in evacuation procedures and first aid for American wounded. Gefreiter Richter, the teenager who'd been worried about losing his arm, was using his good hand to apply pressure to shrapnel wounds suffered by Corporal Sullivan. Oberfeldwebel Waldmann, the hostile SS sergeant who'd refused American treatment, was helping carry American wounded to safer areas of the compound. The sight of enemy prisoners risking their lives to save American medical personnel was surreal beyond description. These men had every reason to let us die. We were their captors, their enemies, representatives of the nation that had defeated their armies and would determine their fate as prisoners. Instead, they were acting as comrades, as fellow human beings committed to preserving life, regardless of nationality or military allegiance. The bombing lasted exactly 14 minutes, but it felt like hours as German prisoners and American medics worked together to save lives and minimize casualties from the ongoing attack. When the Focke-Wulfs finally departed, having exhausted their ammunition and fuel, the scene in our field hospital was one of remarkable cooperation between former enemies united by medical emergency. Weber was unconscious and bleeding severely from multiple shrapnel wounds, but he was alive. His decision to shield me from the bombing had saved my life while risking his own, creating a debt that I could never fully repay. As I worked to treat his wounds while other German prisoners helped evacuate American casualties, I realized that something fundamental had changed in my understanding of these men and their character. They weren't just enemy soldiers who happened to be wounded. They were human beings who'd chosen sacrifice over self-preservation, who'd recognized medical personnel as healing rather than military targets, who'd understood that preserving life was more important than continuing political conflicts. Major Brenner, despite significant injuries from the bombing, organized German prisoners into medical assistance teams that worked alongside American staff to treat casualties from the attack. His leadership and organizational skills proved invaluable in managing the crisis created by 14 minutes of concentrated bombing. "Dr. O'Brien," he said as we worked together to stabilize Weber's condition, "this is what military honor really means, protecting those who heal regardless of what uniform they wear. These German soldiers understand this principle better than some of our own officers." The aftermath of the bombing created bonds between American medical staff and German prisoners that transformed the entire atmosphere of the facility. The hostility and suspicion that had characterized earlier relationships were replaced by mutual respect and cooperation based on shared experience of survival and sacrifice. Weber's recovery became a collective effort involving both American medics and German prisoners. His fellow prisoners donated blood for transfusions, shared their limited personal supplies to make him more comfortable, and provided emotional support during his long convalescence. But Weber's sacrifice had also created an emotional bond between us that went far beyond medical professional relationships. This man had literally saved my life at the risk of his own, had chosen to protect an enemy medic rather than seek his own safety, had demonstrated courage and selflessness that challenged every stereotype I'd held about German soldiers. "Why did you do it?" I asked him when he regained consciousness 3 days after the bombing. "Why did you risk your life to save an American soldier?" Weber thought carefully before answering, his voice still weak from his injuries. "Herr Doctor, you saved my life when I had infection. You worked many hours, used much medicine, treated me like German doctor would treat German patient. When bombs came, I could not let you die when you had been so kind to German prisoner." His explanation was simple but profound, Gratitude had transcended nationality, medical ethics had created human bonds, and individual kindness had been repaid with individual sacrifice. The story of Weber's heroism spread quickly through both American and German military units in the area. American soldiers, who'd initially been skeptical about treating German wounded with full medical resources, began to understand that enemy soldiers were capable of the same courage and selflessness that we admired in our own troops. German prisoners learned that American medical care wasn't just professional obligation, but genuine commitment to healing, that their treatment by American medics reflected broader American values about human dignity and individual worth. But perhaps most importantly, the bombing and its aftermath had created friendships between former enemies that would outlast the war and influence both American and German attitudes toward post-war reconciliation. Major Brenner became my closest collaborator in managing the medical facility, using his leadership skills and language abilities to coordinate care for German patients while serving as liaison with American medical staff. Our professional relationship evolved into genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to medical ethics. "Doctor," he told me one evening as we reviewed patient charts together, "what happened during the bombing shows us that medical duty transcends national loyalty. American and German medics working together, caring for wounded regardless of uniform, this is how the world should work when this war is over." Our collaboration continued until November 15, 1944, when improving military situation allowed for transfer of German prisoners to permanent medical facilities in England and the United States. The farewells were emotional in ways I hadn't anticipated when I first arrived at the Eindhoven hospital. Weber, now recovered enough for transport, approached me with a small wooden cross he'd carved during his convalescence. "So you remember," he said, "that sometimes enemies become friends when they understand that healing is more important than hurting." Major Brenner's farewell was more formal but equally meaningful. "Dr. O'Brien, what you and your staff have taught us about American medical ethics will influence how German prisoners think about America and democracy during our imprisonment and after our eventual return to Germany." Similar farewells followed with Richter, Waldmann, and dozens of other German prisoners who'd experienced American medical care and demonstrated their own capacity for sacrifice and heroism. As their transport convoy departed for the coast and ships bound for prisoner camps, I realized that my understanding of enemy soldiers, medical ethics, and human nature had been fundamentally changed by my experience treating German wounded. These men weren't faceless enemies worthy only of professional obligation. They were individuals capable of courage, sacrifice, gratitude, and friendship. They'd taught me that medical ethics required not just technical competence, but emotional engagement, that healing involved more than treating wounds, but also recognizing the humanity of patients, regardless of their political allegiances. The validation of these lessons came through correspondence that continued long after the war ended. The Red Cross had established programs for exchanging letters between former prisoners and their American guards or medical personnel, and many of the German soldiers I'd treated made contact to express their gratitude and share their post-war experiences. Weber's first letter arrived in 1946, written from a hospital in Bavaria, where he was working as a medical orderly while completing his recovery from war injuries. "I think every day about the American doctor who saved my life and about the lesson I learned that healing is more important than nationality," he wrote. "I am using my experience to help other wounded German soldiers understand that Americans can be friends as well as victorious enemies." Major Brenner wrote from Hamburg, where he was helping to establish democratic medical institutions in the American occupation zone. "What we learned about American medical ethics has influenced how German doctors are being retrained for service in democratic society," he explained. "We use your example to show that medical duty must always transcend political considerations." Richter's letter came from Munich, where he'd enrolled in medical school with the goal of becoming a doctor himself. "You showed me that healing is the most important thing one human can do for another," he wrote. "I want to spend my life helping people the way you helped German prisoners who had no right to expect American kindness." Even Waldmann, the hostile SS sergeant who'd initially refused American treatment, wrote to express his transformation. "I learned during the bombing that courage and honor exist on both sides of this war, that American medics serve the same principles as German medics, that healing unites us while politics divides us. In 1954, 10 years after our separation at Eindhoven, I received an invitation that brought our story full circle. Weber, now fully recovered and working as a medical technician in Munich, had organized a reunion of German prisoners who'd been treated at our field hospital. They wanted to invite me to Germany as their guest, to show me how their experience with American medical care had influenced their post-war lives. The reunion took place in a small church in Bavaria, where Weber and 12 other former prisoners gathered with their families to meet the American medic who'd treated them during their darkest period. The ceremony included a memorial service for soldiers who died during the bombing, both German and American, and a celebration of the friendships that had grown out of shared suffering and mutual sacrifice. "Dr. O'Brien," Weber said as he introduced me to the gathered families, "this is the American medic I told you about, the man who taught us that medical ethics transcend nationality, that healing is more important than politics, that former enemies can become lifelong friends when they recognize their common humanity." During that 1954 visit, I toured medical facilities where former prisoners were working, met their children who'd grown up hearing stories about American kindness, and saw how their experience had influenced an entire generation's attitude toward democracy and international cooperation. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Weber took me to visit the grave of a young German soldier who died during the bombing at Eindhoven, not from enemy action, but from wounds he'd sustained while helping to evacuate American casualties. "He died as a hero," Weber said as we stood beside the simple grave marker, "not because he killed enemies, but because he saved them. That's the lesson we learned from you and your medical staff, that the highest form of courage is choosing to heal rather than harm." Our correspondence continued until Weber's death in 1989, 45 years after that September morning when he'd saved my life during the Luftwaffe bombing. His letters chronicled his career in medical service, his family life, his work promoting German-American friendship through medical exchange programs. But they also reminded me constantly of the lesson we'd both learned during those weeks at Eindhoven, that medical ethics require us to see patients as human beings first and political entities second, that healing creates bonds stronger than nationality or ideology, and that sometimes our enemies teach us more about courage and sacrifice than our own comrades. The wooden cross Weber carved for me still sits on my desk 79 years later, a reminder that enemies can become friends when they're united by commitment to preserving life rather than taking it. Every time I look at it, I remember that September morning when a German prisoner threw his body over mine to save my life, proving that humanity can triumph over hatred even in the midst of the world's most terrible war. This was my story. Staff Sergeant Michael Mickey O'Brien, 101st Airborne Division Medical Corps, who learned that medical duty transcends national boundaries, that enemies can become friends through shared sacrifice, and that sometimes those we are taught to hate demonstrate more courage and humanity than we ever imagined possible. My experience treating German prisoners at Eindhoven taught me that healing creates bonds stronger than politics, that medical ethics require us to see the humanity in everyone who needs our care, and that individual acts of sacrifice can plant seeds of friendship that grow into lasting peace between former enemies. What struck you most about my story of that September bombing? Have you heard similar accounts from family members who served as medics or in medical roles during wartime? These personal testimonies help us understand how individual relationships during conflict can transcend the larger forces that drive nations to war. If you want to hear more first-hand accounts like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow we'll be sharing the story of Captain Sarah Angel Mackenzie, who served as an army nurse, treating wounded prisoners, and discovered how medical care could heal more than just physical wounds. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. Let's make sure their stories live on.